plus members from around the state. We were founded in 1980, so this is actually our 40th anniversary here. So we were founded to be the voice in Lansing for the environmental community. And today our member groups range from groups like Michigan League of Conservation Voters and West Michigan Environmental Action Council to groups like Trout Unlimited, Michigan Nursing Association, the Adrian Dominican Sisters. So we have a wide range of folks who are interested in statewide environmental leadership and policy. Oh, there's a remote.
Yes.
All right.
Kind of a left-right forward back.
All right. So the pulse of Michigan's environment at the state capitol is much like everything else at the state capitol. It is gridlock. There's not much going on, which makes my life both easy and hard. Last year I was here and I talked all about lame duck. I had a nice amount of things to talk about. I think like 10 bills that I touched base on just from like a 2-month period. So since I was here last year, what we knew at that point was we were going to have a new legislature with much closer margins, new governor, attorney general, secretary of state, all new statewide elected officials. Now what do we know? We have a revamped DEQ. It is no longer the Department of Environmental Quality. It's now the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And with a new chair, a new head, Lisa Clark. She has an extensive background in energy. We also have at the Department of Natural Resources, we have Director Dan Eichengerth, formerly of Michigan United Conservation Clubs. Very focused on spreading our natural resources out and making sure that we're having renewable energy as part of their oversight, making sure our state parks and public lands are protected. And then we have a new Department of Agriculture chair as well, former UP lawmaker Gary McDowell, looking at what we can do on the ag front to change how we're managing things. So we've also seen the first budget cycle for the governor, and she just announced her second budget a few weeks ago. So we are starting to get an idea of what the governor's priorities are through that budget process, because this is where she has a lot of direct input into what goes to the legislature. And of course, we're always seeing new legislation and new environmental challenges. So, like I said, we had 10 specific bills when I talked about lame duck, and that was like in a 2-month period. So I don't have really any specific bills to talk to you about today. Instead, I have a number of wide-ranging issues here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a top-level overview of all of these, go in depth a little bit more on a few of them, and then I really want to make this kind of a dialogue. So if you have questions, raise your hand as we go, and then at the end of this, I want to have a little bit more time for questions. I feel like that's the best way to have a discussion like this about what's going on in Lansing. So, top issues for last year and this year. Of course, Line 5 oil pipeline, always one of our top issues in the state. And I'm going to go in more depth on this one in a minute. Statewide septic code, I talked about this last time we were here. The bills that we talked about at that point stalled out. They did not make it through in lame duck. So far this year, there has been no movement on this issue. So the parties who are necessary to get this through the split government are not quite ready to talk yet. There is not much interest in tackling this issue and getting everyone to the table to actually discuss what needs to happen on this issue. So we're still working on it, we're still having internal discussions and still trying to move things along, but at this point the rest of the players aren't necessarily there. So I think by the end of the year you might see something start to bubble up, but look for that maybe in the next legislative session, 21-22.
It's only if you're grading through as well.
What was that?
It'll bubble up if you're grading through as well.
There's that too, yeah. So transportation funding, I mentioned the governor's first budget cycle. This is, of course, we're going to fix the damn roads. I think I'm going more into this in a minute, so I'm going to hold off. PFAS regulations as well. going into. So green ooze and contaminated site cleanups. Does everyone remember green ooze right before Christmas on the highway? So all I can say is we're very thankful that was green. Because if not, and there is actually evidence that stuff had been leaking out of there for a while that wasn't green. So we didn't know about it until it was a Saturday morning cartoon situation. So this is something that we are watching and trying to capitalize on. We have bipartisan interest in this issue at this point. Both Republicans and Democrats are asking some very, very good questions on the hearings on this about why this happened, why state taxpayers are on the hook to clean up for this. So I think this is something that we might see a lot of traction on in the next year. Solid waste law rewrite. Going on year 5 of trying to rewrite our solid waste laws as part of a coalition. This year, I think we are ready to hopefully introduce legislation in the next couple weeks, so keep an eye out on that. Completely rewrites our solid waste law from the ground up. The last time we did this was in the mid-90s. This was, of course, at the time of the garbage barge and where we did not have any place to put trash in landfills. So a lot of states immediately changed their laws to make it much easier to put trash in landfills and to site and develop landfills. We in Michigan did a fantastic job of siting and developing landfills, so much so that now we can't afford to recycle or compost because it's too cost inefficient, because landfilling is so cheap. That's why Canada imports, why 20% of the trash we dispose in Michigan is from Canada. Because it is very cheap to dispose of waste in Michigan here. And it's cheaper to pick up and drive from Toronto to dispose of it in Michigan than it is to dispose of it in a Canadian landfill. So we are working on this. It will completely revamp from the ground up what we're doing and really focus on counties accounting for everything that goes out of the county and how it's managed, whether it's recycled, composted, or landfilled. Bottle bill. This is one that I have not seen this much interest in years. It takes a 3/4 majority of both chambers of the legislature to make changes to this. Yet we see 3 different bills packages all having news hits and traction in the legislature right now. So this is very interesting time on this issue. I don't think anything major will probably happen. There might be some changes, but I don't think the big changes that you would think of, like expansion, are going to happen in this cycle, but there will likely be changes to the bottle bill in this cycle. Algal blooms, right now is a good time to talk about algal blooms because they're not happening, and we need to start to get ahead of it, of course. We have the domestic action plan from MDARD and EGLE was just released. Our update to that and our adaptive management. Our team is currently reviewing it at this point, but from our quick review at this point, it continues to be insufficient to actually address the problems facing Lake Erie. It is continuing to rely on voluntary practices, which have not worked anywhere they've been tried, and refuses to really look at a lot of the numbers. For example, one of our watersheds has actually seen an uptick in phosphorus over the past few years. And the response there is that the federal government stopped paying for a certain conservation program, so there's nothing we can do. Like this is where we're at in terms of trying to manage Lake Erie. And then this one is new, that has really hit the news cycle. High water and erosion. We are in the rainiest 1, 3, and 5 year periods in state history. So if you go back over the past 5 years, we've seen more rain than any previous 5 year period recorded on record. And this is causing Great Lakes water to be extraordinarily high. It's causing inland water to be extraordinarily high. And as part of our dynamic shoreline ecosystems, there's a lot of erosion. This is causing, of course, much consternation as folks' homes are put at risk, but also what has not been as noteworthy in the news cycle is all the public infrastructure that is at risk. There's a number of water treatment plants and both wastewater and incoming drinking water plants that are within a couple hundred feet of the shoreline that have infrastructure that relies on flow and gravity and certain hydraulic pressures to flow the water out. when the water's coming up this high, those flows don't work. So things are starting to back up, things are starting to not work as they are supposed to, and that is really where we're going to have a massive infrastructure crisis on our hands, on top of the other massive infrastructure crises that we already have on our hands. So this is something that is emerging. Eagle has done a summit on this. There are a number of pieces of legislation. I think I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, so I'm just going to keep going here. Yeah, so, yeah, I should have done this earlier. So the other part, PFAS regulations, the other thing I forgot to note, the maximum contaminant level in drinking water just moved from the environmental rulemaking panel this week. So that goes to the next step in the process where we will have a set number on drinking water for a number of PFAS compounds that is in line with where science seems to be pointing right now and treatment technology is seeming to be pointing right now. I believe, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's somewhere between 7 and 14 for most of these. So it is much lower than it was, and we're also moving significantly faster than the EPA, which is good. High water and erosion. So you can see maybe some pictures here of homes falling in, and a lot of shoreline erosion. So what's happening so far on this? Eagle announced last fall that they will be expediting all permitting on this topic. So they have shrunk their turnaround times to, on average, it's about 2 days from when you turn in your permit to getting your permit issued. If you have revisions to be done to your permit, it takes about 7 days. This is very, 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 very fast for a department. They are rerouting a bunch of staff to this because it is a major problem. However, what we've seen from looking at some of these permits is that it is clear that the review is lacking. And we are concerned about some permanent shoreline changes that are likely to occur because of this. And the other part of this that is maybe not focused on as much is if you do a shoreline erosion protection on your property and you do it not quite right, you actually increase the risk to your two neighbors. And oftentimes you'll see, that's where one of the houses that fell in actually, or had to be demolished before it fell in, was caused due to that interaction with the neighboring shelters. But we've seen things like one in Muskegon, someone put in a permanent concrete barrier that can never, ever, ever be removed to protect the shoreline. We have some questions about that, but it went through the permitting process, permitting process, got reviewed, got permitted. So we have some concerns, but we understand that the part of this is making sure that emergencies, situations are reacted to. The other problem here is that contractors are already booked 3-4 months out. So Eagle is hearing from folks that, well, you're telling, I can't get my permit in 2 days, like you're lying. No, your contractor is telling you that they can't get the permit, when in reality, they just can't get to you for 3 months because they're so booked up. Same with engineers. In sand dune areas, in critical dune areas, you need an engineering stamp in order to do work and get your permit. We have a distinct lack of engineers who are able to take the time to do this. So it's not just Eagle permitting that's slow, it's all the pieces of this are now getting packed up. So what Eagle is actually doing next steps is they are going to allow contractors to go ahead and do the work without the engineering stamp if Eagle reviews it and says it's sufficient, and they'll get the engineering stamp later. So it's actually, they're trying to move this process along as quick as possible to protect people's homes. As part of this response is the legislative response. Senate Bill 714 from Senator Victory. What this does is allows you to, when water levels hit a certain point, put in shoreline protection that's approved by Eagle in some way, shape, or form. However, you then don't have to get a permit for 1.5 years. So you can just put this up, and again, this is where if you put it up wrong, your neighbors are more at risk. And also, this is a joint permitting program from the state and federal government. So if you put something in and you didn't get a permit for it from the state, you were now out of compliance with the U.S. Army Corps. So we've actually put in this bill, and it's moving pretty rapidly. It's already in the House and ready to move in the House. That says, okay, you can be in violation of federal law. It's not something we really want to do. It's not something we are okay with, and we've been working to make this making sure that we continue to maintain the integrity of the permitting process here. And again, like I said, the Eagle had a high water summit with the legislature and municipalities and other county, like county road commissions, county drain commissioners, township folks, who are all affected by this, to talk about what the next steps are, what the emergencies are, and do some scenario planning. And then the governor's response to this has been to put climate resiliency money into the budget. So there's, I believe, $40 million in the Department of Treasury that is designed to give out to local municipalities to do climate action planning, climate mitigation, and adaptation planning, and then also a number of dollars to actually go do that work and actually, invest in moving the infrastructure, moving things around and protecting them from this high water. Because we're also, should know, Army Corps expecting another rise, potentially 10 inches more this year. So again, this is not going away. Inland lakes are starting to be at risk here, inland lake infrastructure. And realistically, the other part of this is a lot of this is on dune. And dunes, and especially our protected dunes, critical dune infrastructure, are by their design mobile systems. They are dynamic, shifting ecosystems. We actually, very soon there should be a full report on this, but we're part of a grant project wherein we collected pictures of dunes now and dunes at different points in time. We have some pictures going back to the 20s of what this particular site looked like. Then a photographer went out and actually took a picture from that same exact spot right today. It is astounding how much has changed, even in some of these short periods of time. So, dynamic and changing situation, it's not going away anytime soon. And some of the things that really need to be addressed are contractor shortages, engineering shortages, and really starting to talk about permanent setbacks from the Great Lakes. Like, you cannot build within X feet of the Great Lakes, because this is not going to stop. PFAS. So I said this a little bit. The maximum contaminant level has been proposed and moving along for drinking water. Again, this passed out of the Environmental Rules Review Committee last week, and now goes to the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules in the legislature, wherein they can either let it go for 15 session days and do nothing, which means that sometime in early May, these rules would start to go into the final stages to going into effect. They can choose to take them up and then delay them for up to 9 months, which would push us into the next session, which means the next JCAR can get their hands on them and delay them another 9 months to a year. So, depending on what the legislature wants to do, these could go into effect in May, or it could go into effect at an indefinitely later time. We will be working to, make sure that the legislature is educated on the benefits and why this MCL is needed, and hopefully move forward quickly on this, as the governor has tried to do. We also, the Attorney General announced a legal settlement with Wolverine Worldwide in Rockford, wherein Wolverine will have to pay to connect municipal drinking water infrastructure to those affected by their plume, and then continue to monitor the groundwater plume and where it's going. So it's a pretty large settlement, but I think we're going to wait and see how some of the parts of it play out, especially with some of the self-monitoring that Wolverine is required. We want to make sure that they're going to follow through with that appropriately. The Michigan PFAS Action Response Team was dissolved and reorganized by the governor early last year. They are still very active, still digging into a number of issues still to come on things such as biosolids. There was a large study on biosolids and biosolid land applications and PFAS from biosolids. They're looking into what the impacts are of that. They're looking into things like crop uptake. Does it come up through the food, or is it solely a water pathway? So there's a number of different issues that are still being looked at for PFAS exposure, and we're still learning so much about this. There was, for example, the do not eat order on deer in Clark's Marsh outside of Oscoda due to high PFAS levels that they were testing there. From what I've read recently, the meat of the deer didn't really have high PFAS in it. The liver had extraordinarily high PFAS in it. So it's one of those things like maybe some parts are edible, some parts aren't. It's just such a new thing that we're studying. And again, I hesitate to say emergent chemical because this has been around from the 60s. I think it's contaminant of emerging concern is a better way to phrase it. We didn't know it was concerning until recently. And so now we're doing all the studies and hopefully we'll be able to get ahead of it. And then lastly, transportation funding. So governor's budget, everyone probably remembers that last year there was a 45-cent gas tax increase proposed by the governor. Obviously we are not paying 45 cents more per gallon of gas right now, so that did not go through. The legislature did not like it in any way, shape, or form. And part of the problem was, and that we actually had with it, was it would bypass Act 51. So we have passed in the 1950s a road funding act formula that divvies out road money to the state and local governments and sets aside 10% for public, for comprehensive transportation fund, which is rail and public transit. This would bypass that entirely and only gave 3% to public transit. We did not agree with that, and we worked with the governor's team to help try to fix that. But clearly this didn't go anywhere anyway. So this year, Governor did not include any additional dollars for roads outside of her bonding authority. She has independent authority to bond for roads, so she's accelerating certain state priority projects, things like I-75, I-94, rebuilds that need to happen, bridges like the bridge that a chunk of bridge fell off and struck somebody, unfortunately, just south of Lansing. That bridge is actually on the list of things that was already being bonded for to increase the speed of construction. But she's not going back to the legislature for this. But what that means is public transit money is not seeing significant increases either. And we know that a lot of local bus operators are struggling. And if the RTA, which is continuing to move through the legislature with some changes, in Southeast Michigan, could put an additional strain on local bus operating dollars if they actually get up and running. And then finally, actually just last week, the governor did create a new task force on mobility, took the council on future mobility and removed it. That was focused entirely on autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles. Rebuilt that to look at electrification, public transit, and autonomous and connected vehicles. So really looking at our whole system of mobility and how people get around. It has also created a position of a chief mobility officer within our economic development department to help connect all these players better. So we actually have someone focused solely on mobility and building out mobility in Michigan and making Michigan a leader again in moving people from point A to point B. So, I'll give you a lot of overview here, and I just want to get some good news that's going on right now. First, appointees to various commissions, though a lot of news has been made in the last couple of weeks on the Natural Resources Commission appointees from the governor being shot down by the Senate. Overall, the governor has appointed a lot of really good people to a number of these commissions that oversee environmental rules. Things like the Ag Commission, things like the Transportation Commission, looking at things like the Environmental Rules Committee that I mentioned earlier. There's been a lot of really good appointments going out that are focused on clean air, clean health, climate change, and everything pressing on the environment. Also, as part of the Eagle creation, there is now a head of climate change in Eagle, someone whose focus is solely on climate change. There's someone who's a drinking water public advocate, solely looking at how advocating for the people on drinking water. Environmental justice public advocate, looking at everything from environmental justice lens, and also created the Environmental Justice Advisory Council in order to dig really deep into these issues. And then lastly, as part of some executive directives, all the departments are looking at recycling. What are their contract situations like? How can we get recycling in every state building in the state? And energy usage, there's a statewide energy audit ongoing right now. And how can we reduce our energy use at state buildings? So this is all some really good things that are ongoing. All the directors that I've talked to are on board with this and are happy to go along with this. And on energy side, places like the DNR, they're looking at how can we site solar on some of our public lands? How can we site maybe wind on some of our public lands? What's the system for that? How are we going to allow utilities to use this space? What's the royalty kind of set up? How does this leasing work? And they're really digging in and trying to figure out how to do this so we can get state parks to net zero. They're working a massive amount of upgrades at a fish hatchery. Fish hatcheries use 15% of the power DNR uses in a year. We have 6 of them. And they use up 15% of the entire DNR's energy portfolio. So they're really digging in on some of those. So across the board, there's some really good things happening behind the scenes for the environment. But in terms of public policy and what the legislature is doing, very, very slow. So I think we have a good 15 minutes for questions, and start right here.
Yeah, so what are NBC's top environmental priorities for 2020? Even do the top 3.
So our top 3 priorities for 2020. Number 1, I would say, is probably around drinking water. One of the top ones is filter first. So this is requiring or getting money to schools to put in hydration stations, filtered hydration stations, instead of going through the process of testing all the schools for lead and PFAS. Then spending all that money, finding out that yes, they do in fact have lead and PFAS, and then having to pay to upgrade and address them. Instead, it's actually, it's looking at some of the cost benefit there. It's actually cheaper to just put the hydration station in the first place. So trying to find money and policy on that. That's one of our top priorities. Second one, I'd say, is probably the solid waste rewrite. That is something that is a high priority to get done. We want to make sure that at least parts of that get through this year.
What are the key issues there?
So the key issue there is county solid waste planning, in my opinion. So right now, county solid waste planning is all designed about, like I said, siting landfills. If you don't have landfill capacity identified, you have to site a landfill, and then you can override all local zoning and site a landfill somewhere. This change gets rid of most of that, actually funds the planning process, and requires the planners to look at how much recycling and composting is available that is being discarded in their county, identify the needs for recycling and composting facilities in the county, and then set goals. We have a 45% statewide recycling goal. They have to show progress towards meeting that in order to get certain grant funds, as well as meeting their own materials utilization goals. So recycling rate is just recycling, composting, amount disposed. Materials utilization rate can be things like new emerging technologies like anaerobic digestion or pyrolysis or gasification. Diversions from landfill can count as part of a county's materials utilization goal. So this would allow Kent County, for example, with the Covanta plant, to set a goal of actually 100% materials utilization. However, that may or may not meet their 45% recycling rate goal, depending on how much is going to the Covanta facility. And also keeping the planning commissions around. So it used to be that you plan, the commission would go away, 5 years later you'd reconvene them, and they wouldn't know what was going on anymore. This intends a permanent commission that oversees this whole thing. And the last part is access standards. So we set in the law recycling access standards for both urban and rural communities for curbside pickup and drop-off locations. And if you choose not to plan as a county, you automatically, the waste haulers operating in your county, the state writes your plan and mandates those haulers to meet those goals immediately. In counties that do choose to plan, they get some flexibility in how long they get to implement them. So that is kind of the core of this. And it also helps site composting. It gives composting and recycling facilities some of the protections that landfills have traditionally enjoyed grants, as long as the counties allow for it. And number 3, I'd say probably looking at water use. And we are a member of the Water Use Advisory Council. This year, a lot of focus is on kind of catching up with that council because there were 100-some recommendations like 10 years ago. So going through that, and by the end of the year, we want to have identified what recommendations have been met, what recommendations we need, what we still need to go work on, and really start mapping our groundwater resources as things like Ottawa County are hitting grind because they've overused, overdrawn. And in some places, we've hit the point where the tool that we use says there shouldn't be any water in the creek, but there's still water in the creek, so clearly something is not quite right with the tool. In some places it's saying there should be plenty of water and there's visible downgrades in the amount of water. So really trying to get that program back into shape is one of our higher priorities of the year.
Are there any plans in place to stop the PFAS before it reaches the rivers that dump into the Great Lakes?
Are there any plans in place to stop PFAS in the groundwater before it reaches the rivers? That kind of
That dump
into the Great Lakes? The answer is no, because it's technically infeasible. There is no way to actually actively treat the groundwater right now. So they're doing it in Oscoda. They're doing a pump and dump where they pump the groundwater out, treat it, and dump it in the water. So there is a possibility here. Part of the problem is actually we don't know where our groundwater is. We have an idea. We know that if you drop a well here, but we don't know where it's flowing necessarily. So things like the TCE plume outside of Barcelona, we've kind of identified that plume very well. We knew it was moving, and then suddenly it hit an area of groundwater that moved much faster than we had any idea. And all of a sudden, it's threatening a bunch of new homes that we weren't planning for yet.
So there's no one tracking where the PFAS is?
So tracking where the PFAS is almost, it's not necessarily technically feasible right now. It just, the focus has been on making sure people aren't drinking it. Once we get everyone whose well is at risk protected, I think the next step will be looking at how do we get it to, how do we start the treatment process of it in various places. Yes, and the tracking of it.
It just keeps getting a wider area
Yes.
that's contaminated, so it's moving.
Yes. And the sad thing about PFAS is much like a lot of these other chemicals, it is persistent. It is almost indestructible.
Or if you can't bathe in it, what's it going to do to our swimming water?
Yeah. So my understanding right now is that drinking it is the #1 concern.
The ladies that gave this speech, the first ones,
Yeah.
they couldn't shower.
So that's interesting because that's different than the science that I've seen on it, but there's so much emerging right now that maybe we'll find something new. But the state of the science that I've last heard is that skin contact has not been a major pathway. But again, it's emerging.
Just briefly, the other speaker didn't say that showering was at the same level of its importance as drinking. So there could be some discrepancy in terms of how much it impacts your body. But showering isn't good, but it's not near as harmful as drinking. I think that's kind of what she was saying. I don't know if Ray.
But she said,
Yeah, so it
She
would depend on the
was
level.
literally feet from it.
Yeah, so if you're getting into parts per million, yeah, then you're talking maybe avoiding bathing. But at the parts per trillion level, the absorption to the skin is minimal from what science is showing us right now.